Welcome to NetThing 2020. My name is Melody and I will be your MC for today. You are now joining us for our final and much anticipated panel, Censorship and Expression Online, whose voices are amplified and whose are silenced. We've gone through a variety of topics today, from a throwback of Australia's internet and challenges facing us today, to policy and digital platforms, to truth and trust, and then the gamification of our future, to the internet's infrastructure and security. Now, we will be discussing censorship and expression on the internet. Before we begin, I have 4 things to remind you. All sessions are recorded and also live streamed on YouTube. Be mindful of our code of conduct published on netthing.org.au, and also the link is available in Zoom chat. If you're feeling confident today, how about sharing a photo of you joining us from home or from your office on Twitter using the hashtag NetThing by checking out the photo booth selfie that is kindly provided by our sponsor GoDaddy Registry. The link is also in the Zoom chat. For this session, if you have any questions or comments, use the Q&A button to type your questions, or if you're a little bit more confident, please raise your hand because we love to receive audible questions. Use Zoom chat box only for questions that's not related to this panel. That is all from me. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the session, Yasmin Abdel Majid. Yasmin will introduce our panelists for this session. Yasmin, would you like to introduce yourself and also your panelists?
Sure. Thank you so much, Melody. So my name is Yasmin Abdel Majid. I go by the pronouns she, her, and I'm incredibly excited to bring you this panel on censorship and expression. So before I introduce my panelists, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country. I personally am I'm on like the land of the colonizers, so it doesn't fully have the same weight, but for everybody else who's on the panel, they'll also be acknowledging country, and wherever you are as well, it's important to acknowledge the land, or the original owners of the land on that we are gathered on, wherever we are in the world. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the topic before I introduce our esteemed panelists. So, the internet and social media is often framed as a place in which people have an opportunity to be heard, find and build communities, and express themselves freely. However, all that glitters is not gold. Despite the promise of free expression, marginalised and minoritized voices continue to face disproportionate silencing online. In this panel, we're exposing the causes and impact of algorithmic bias, content policing, and censorship. Offline stigma and discrimination continue to translate into online spaces, with sex workers, queer and trans activists, BIPOC, fat activists, and disabled folks continuing to be censored, policed, and shadow banned online. There has been a lot of attention being given recently to the challenge of content moderation, but almost always from the angle of reducing extremist content, violent videos, and misinformation and disinformation online. People love to talk about the need and responsibility of social media platforms to remove hate speech, violent videos, etc. We focus that what they're failing to moderate, but the mainstream conversation very rarely focuses on the things that these platforms are removing and censoring. A big question is, what role social media platforms should play in this? Should they be given the task to decide what is and isn't appropriate? And what responsibilities do they have? I'm so excited to have 3 fantastic people to discuss this with us today. We have Celeste Carnegie, she, her. Celeste Carnegie is a Birragubba and South Sea Islander woman from the far north Queensland who has been at the forefront of STEM education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth. Celeste is passionate about digital inclusion and empowering young people to achieve their goals in technology, and she is currently working at Indigitech as the program director. We also have Lola Hunt, who also goes by she, her. Lola is a Melbourne-based sex worker and the co-founder of Assembly 4, a social enterprise with the goal of empowering sex workers with technology. She has been recently focused on helping other sex workers fight the FOSTA SESTA through technological solutions. Lola and 2 other co-founders of Assembly 4 aim to bridge the gap between the multi-billion-dollar sex industry and the tech industry. and Claire Fitzsimmons, who goes by she, they. Claire Fitzsimmons is the founder and director of Salty, an independent digital publishing platform for women, trans, and non-binary people, which reaches 2 million worldwide readers each month. After experiencing deplatforming and censorship on social media and other networks, Salty created an algorithmic bias research team to gather data around the ways our community is silenced online. The report on algorithmic bias is on the Salty website, as well as their essay, The Patriarchy is in the Algorithms. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'm so honored and excited to be sharing this panel and platform with you. And I'm going to start with this question. Over-surveilling and over-policing of marginalized and minoritized voices in real life is reflected in online spaces. Can each of you give us an example of how this happens in recent times, so that perhaps for people who aren't aware in the audience, we can get an understanding of the scale and scope of the issue? And Celeste, I might start with you.
That's a big question. I think there's a small difference between that real self and that virtual self, and in terms of how Indigenous people, I'll talk to specifically, are treated, that very much does translate into the online world, whether we have to try and keep ourselves safe within any spaces that we're a part of. So whilst it's not new, and whilst that's quite what our normal is most of the time, which is unfortunate, there is kind of a resilience that happens within the online space, just as in the real world, in terms of protecting ourselves and protecting the culture. And I think that, you see that a lot in terms of Indigenous people being silenced online, or, having their content deleted, or I guess not having a safe space to even have their views or share their opinions. So it's like at the very basics where we're being limited, and I guess that's how it kind of reflects into that online world.
Thank you, Celeste. I'll come to you now, Lola.
Yeah, sure. So so the surveillance and policing of marginalised communities, as Celeste mentioned, that isn't a new thing, nor is the weaponisation of moral panic to facilitate it. We've seen this happen throughout history. We saw this with the war on drugs, targeting Black and Brown communities. We saw this with the war on terror, targeting Muslim communities. And unfortunately, it seems that the next iteration of this is the anti-trafficking movement. I think it's important to understand the roots of this surveillance and the companies that are perpetuating the harm towards these groups, as it puts us in a better position to find a solution rather than focusing on the harm that is caused. The current moral panic, as I mentioned previously in the media, is around sex trafficking. As you all may know and have heard of QAnon, this is an extension of this group, and it's very much being used as a facade for the implementation of mass surveillance and policing of marginalised communities. Why this is potentially more dangerous than, say, the war on drugs is because it's happening on a global scale, and it also involves tools which are much more advanced. I guess I wanted to give you guys a quick rundown as well of the anti-trafficking organisations which are involved in this movement. A lot of these are faith-based orgs or connected to faith-based organisations. Most of them will work with law enforcement or develop software for law enforcement, or they run anti-trafficking training programs for law enforcement. They also don't acknowledge that consensual sex work is real and tend to diagnose sex trafficking as only affecting girls and women, which we know is not true. The statistics they have are majorly flawed, and the ones that they promote are often misrepresented data, data which is just blatantly made up, or data which has been exaggerated or denounced by the original researcher, which has actually happened. And the number of actual sex trafficking victims is much lower than they claim it to be. It's also a much more complicated issue than just the victim versus criminal sort of binary that they are pushing. And I would strongly recommend you listen to a podcast episode that I will link in the chat at some point, which covers all this in much more detail. So I don't have to go through 15 minutes of time just talking about sex trafficking. But the other thing they do is that they fail to acknowledge these studies which have been proven that reducing sex trafficking is actually a matter of addressing things like poverty in marginalised communities, domestic abuse, and fixing things like the foster care system. These things have been proven to not only decrease sex trafficking, but also reduce the amount of people getting into sex work. The other thing to know about this sort of movement is that it's extremely lucrative. So in a 2015 investigation into these companies by Truth Out, it was found that the top 50 anti-trafficking organisations, who are not-for-profits, by the way, so they don't pay tax, were making over $686 million in income annually. So this is in grants, this is in donations and book sales. And that's also not including the $1.5 billion that's allocated by the US government annually. And this was before Moral Panic and before Trump. So that number is probably a lot higher now. And something to keep in mind as well when thinking about this is that the US has a privatized prison system. So there are people who are financially invested in keeping people incarcerated, which is definitely a part of this equation. In terms of how these directly affect sex workers, an example of this is a company called Thorn, which is run by or co-founded by Ashton Kutcher, of course. One of the projects under Thorn is Spotlight. So Spotlight targets and non-consensually scrapes adult websites to create databases to help tech companies stop online sex trafficking. These massive databases of consensual sex workers is then shared with companies like Facebook, Instagram, Tinder, OkCupid. I know that Airbnb and PayPal have their own versions of this. And from what we know, these are the companies that are kicking marginalised people off their platforms and erasing us. It doesn't sound like much to have to be kicked off like Facebook or something like that. I know that when I was trying to explain it to my dad, he didn't really understand the gravity of the situation. But when this information is also being shared with law enforcement and you begin to lose access to real world services, online violence trickles into offline violence very, very quickly. And ultimately, these companies are starting to decide who gets to have money and access to money and resources and who doesn't, regardless of where you are in the world and the legality of your existence.
Thank you, Lola. And it is really, there's a couple of things that you said that I think really struck home. Number one, the idea that people think that because it's just an online platform, it's not that kind of big of a deal. But really, our online personas, our online profiles and so on are becoming part of, as you say, our offline world, and we're inseparable from them, and our access to all sorts of things. One of the things I often think about is during COVID, lots of places have become cashless. And so even if you don't, if you're not on the sort of credit system, or if you don't have online proof of identity in the ways that governments and companies want you to, you can't actually, even if you have the cold hard cash, you can't actually purchase things. And so there are ways that people are slowly kind of being marginalized, and how folks make money from the censorship and the marginalization of particular voices. Thank you. Claire, I'm going to come to you because I know Salty's done quite a bit on this.
Yeah, just to co-sign on what everybody else is saying, these voices of women, trans, non-binary people, people of color, disabled people have been systemically erased from history. So this is not something that is new. This is just like being reinterpreted and reimagined for the digital world. So it's just like being amplified in the tech space. But ways that, I mean, I can just give examples of the ways that Salty has faced this kind of censorship. And it's twofold. It's on the tech side, and then it's on the user side as well. So for example, the day that Salty launched, we were kicked off MailChimp before we sent our first email. In fact, we were deplatformed for violating community guidelines. Secondly, Salty can't run ads on our website. You know, we run, it's like, Salty is like Cosmo if for 2020, you know, it's like, but we can't run ads on our website because all of the tech infrastructure has deemed our content to be sex work content. They believe that Salty is soliciting sex work because we talk about sex dating and relationships, and because we amplify trans voices and lesbian voices and queer voices. And so the algorithm assumes that what we're doing is solicitation. So we can't run ads on our website, and that means we can't make money, and that means we can't survive in many ways. So these is like they're we can't, you know, and that's like, if we can't survive, then we're being erased. And then on the social media side, we can't run ads on social either, because Instagram thinks that we're soliciting again. Like we test a lot of imagery around, it's just like a trans woman having a conversation with another trans woman, or like a woman in a wheelchair, or an intersex person sitting, and constantly we're being flagged and we can't advertise at all. And so there's that side of things. And then on the other side, which Celeste talked about, is like feeling unsafe in the space. So we come under attack, you know, harassment campaigns from men's rights activists, bigots. We've been deplatformed from Instagram because we became under an attack from this musician who decided that he hated us. It was just like, it comes from all angles for us. And it's just like, yeah, it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
And it sounds, and I see Celeste nodding, so I might come to you just before we go on to the next, but it just, I think the thing that's incredibly frustrating is A, this is happening on platforms that promise free expression. But B, you don't get any choice in it at all. There's no kind of recourse, is kind of what I'm hearing as well. Like, it's not like you can sort of it's not like you're in a court of law where you can say, well, actually, we're not soliciting. It's just a decision that's been made.
No, and these platforms are designed like black boxes. You know, you can't talk to them, you can't reach out to them, you can't coordinate with them. And the only people that can are the people that know somebody on the inside, right? And so if you have a friend, and the people that know somebody on the inside are people of privilege, they're people of industry, they're people that work in tech. And so that, you know, like, thankfully, through Salty's hustling and calling out and like movement, we've been able to like weasel in and get in, but we're incredibly lucky to be able to do that now.
Yeah, and that shouldn't be how it's designed. Celeste, did you want to add anything before I go on to the next question?
No, but I'm just nodding my head because it's relatable, you know, and you're constantly thinking about, like, I'm struggling enough trying to identify with my own identity, and to be on these platforms where you feel unsafe and people are telling you who you are, you know, or who you're allowed to be here, you know, you're not allowed to be this person here when you're on this platform, and it's really disheartening, and you know, and it makes you angry, you know, and then people wonder why we're angry, and then we have to respond in really peaceful ways to situations that totally made me angry. So like, I guess it's kind of just, I'm just relating to what you were all saying, and I feel you.
I love that. You're like, what do you mean you asked me why I'm angry? If you were in my situation, you too would be incandescent with rage. I'm going to pick up on something Claire mentioned, which is about this idea of community guidelines. So, you know, people often talk about, you know, they ominously talk about the idea of the algorithm, but ultimately, you know, people are behind these algorithms, and people have programmed each platform to behave in certain ways. So, you know, these community guidelines are sort of guidelines, rules set out by these platforms that they use to moderate the content, but it doesn't always kind of play out. And Lola, I might come to you first on how these community guidelines play out, because I know that sex workers in particular tend to get targeted quite a lot.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that something that has happened in the last couple of years because of some of the legislation that has been passed, like FOSTA SESTA, which we will talk about in a little bit, is that it has led to the profiling of sex workers, as Claire mentioned. And this has meant that we are trying to be, as sex workers, we're trying to like parade as normal people, or like as civilians who aren't sex workers on these platforms, but it's also meaning that it's making our lives difficult to get work. You know, we often using mainstream platforms is using mainstream platforms as a sex worker, you kind of expect to get kicked off now. When we are using a lot of financial platforms like Stripe or PayPal. PayPal is a really good example of this, actually. Everyone sort of warns each other in the community not to use those platforms because PayPal, for example, have been known to not only boot workers from the platform, but also strip them of all the money. Like they take the money that's in the account and there's no recourse. We can't do anything about it. And because they sit in this place, which they are not legally speaking a bank, and they're not legally speaking just a tech platform, there is no recourse that we can take. So because we have taken, sorry, you go.
Can I put, no, I'm just gonna like clarify something for people, because I think that you sort of mentioned it at the beginning, but sometimes people don't fully understand that like there is a difference between trying to tackle sex trafficking and sex workers who have their own agency, making their own choices and being unable to do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's also a lot of misinformation going around about sex trafficking at the moment, which I spoke about briefly before, which is impacting the way that we work, because the way that anti-trafficking orgs and others have been perpetuating sex trafficking is that no woman or no person can consent to sex work. So, which is obviously incredibly problematic when we're talking about community guidelines, when we're talking about legislation, because the reality is there are consensual sex workers out there, and there's a lot of them, and they are, because the reason that the industry is growing as well is because things like poverty are growing, and things like not being able to access public health care or things like that. So it does it such a disservice when we're labeling consensual sex work as strictly as sex trafficking, because that binary does not work.
Claire, did you want to add something there? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Not really, but like absolutely, Lola, everything that you're saying, the way that conflating consensual sex work and sex trafficking, like, and they did that on purpose, you know, they used the language of sex trafficking, the scary language, and then they, when they call it FOSTA SESTA, which is like, the law is literally called like, it's like, what's the acronym, Lola, exactly? It's like
Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act.
Right. Yeah.
And
so they use it as a way, as like a Trojan horse, basically, to like eliminate consensual sex workers off the platforms.
Yeah. I'd also like to add that it's not like there isn't legislation at the moment to stop sex trafficking. Like we have, from country to country, every country has legislation already in place, which does extend to online to combat sex trafficking. So these laws are just, as well as being harmful, they're not necessary. Yeah, they're just doing such a disservice in so many different ways. I'm not sure if I want to go into it just yet, but I'll let you continue, Yasmin.
That's okay. Oh, sorry, yes, Claire?
Yeah, so to follow on that, I mean, like the sex workers really are the canaries in the coal mine in this instance, because like, for example, with what has happened with Salty, with our content being flagged as being solicitation when it is not, when we're literally just amplifying the stories of trans women and their lived experiences, is that we are getting caught up in the algorithm, or like whatever that they're they're basically heavy-handed algorithms, because, you know, they're so these platforms are so panicked that they're going to get in trouble under the FOSTA SESTA laws, that they are blacklisting entire like umbrellas of content, which is like, you know, basically all the content that we create, and a lot of the content that is created by not marginalized people as well, and a lot of the content that pertains to conversations about sex and dating and identity, and so it's like, it's part of like this bigger picture.
Yeah. And the irony, I think, is like, you might have a post get taken down because it's talking about something to do with sex or identity, but not a post where somebody's brandishing a machine gun, talking about how they want to kill particular parts of the population. You know, I think, and I think that's also quite fascinating, and talks to kind of like the underlying values that are within the algorithm, but ultimately that are built in by the folks who are creating these algorithms, who are deciding what the community guidelines are, what kind of information, what kind of content is perhaps not suitable under their, judgment for a platform, but ultimately it reflects the perspective of a small group of people. And Celeste, I wanted to kind of come to you here, and did you have anything else to add on this idea of community guidelines, and perhaps how it's affected Indigenous communities? Because I know that quite a lot of Black activists and Indigenous activists find themselves also caught up in these community guidelines, and often also have other people police them, not just the algorithm itself, but other people on the platforms reporting them, and so on.
Yeah, it comes at you from all different angles. And I think what people also need to realize in those instances is that there are the community guidelines online, but there were also the community guidelines that we as a peoples have within our own families and within our own communities and within our own culture. And that they don't go together. Their community guidelines and our community guidelines don't go together, and I feel like they're very limiting in how we present ourselves. Like even today in this conversation, I constantly think about how what I say and how I'm censoring myself, because I do know that I represent a group of people. So I guess it's hard enough just to get your brain around that, let alone where you fit into a platform, into these algorithms and these structures that weren't made by anyone that looked like me, or anyone that is from where I'm from, or anyone that understands or has the same perspective. So I can't feel safe in these areas where I know it wasn't made for me to be a part of. But I guess these community guidelines, even just algorithms, do affect us. I mean, back in like 2017, New South Wales Police were using AI to come up with algorithms and for like a risk assessment tool. And it was about, calculating how likely a person was to offend. And I think like 44% of that list that they came up with were young Indigenous Australians, some as young as 11. So, algorithms really do affect our communities and I guess how we just exist.
And if I can build on that, like what would a better online space look like in your opinions? Like in your opinion, how, have you, and perhaps this work that you do within Digitech, like what is that online space look like?
People can stop being racist for one.
That would be nice.
This would be great. A safe online space for me is like, it's just one where we can exist freely in our Blackness and within our culture without having to justify it. We can't control what people say and do it on an individual level, but I do think that companies and their platforms that they have need to play a more active role, I guess, in moderating what occurs on their page and in their comment sections. We don't want to silence people, but I think too many pages allow for that violent dialogue to occur. And I can only speak for myself, but when I see it, I guess it then becomes an unsafe space for me, and I will just not engage, really. And so I guess understanding how to moderate those racist comments and those hurtful discussions can only come from experience, and then that takes you on those bigger discussions around diversity in the workplace, because you need those different perspectives within the workplace in order to know how to moderate those types of discussions. And that's why you see such an imbalance in the way that people's discussions are moderated. It's never been a safe space for anybody, this is my personal opinion. I don't think it's ever been a safe space for anybody, and it's not somewhere that I would go to feel safe and secure. But I've found strength in these platforms, and I've also found it contributed negatively to my mental health in some instances. So it's never going to be a consistent experience for anyone, let alone Black people.
Thank you. And I just building on something you said there that made me reflect, often we're moderated online by folks who have no skin in the game and have no idea how our communities work. As you say, Celeste, like the community that you're a part of has its own set of guidelines, right? We all belong to particular groups of people that have ways of operating. And if you come in from the outside, regardless of who you are, and you don't have any sense of what the norms of this particular community is, you're not going to do a good job and you're going to get it wrong. But there hasn't been any sort of, there has been this expectation that one rule can rule them all, when that's just never been the way that the world has ever worked. No. I'm going to come to you, Claire, to talk not quickly, but to talk about your algorithmic bias in content moderation research that Salty did, and tell us a little bit about the kind of responses and perhaps what happens next. Before then, Lola, I'll come to you to talk about FOSTA SESTA.
Sure, yeah. So we undertook this research as in response to the censorship that we were seeing. And so I can I share my screen? And I can walk through what was going on. So basically, so last year, because I'm on the back end of this stuff, I see this every day when I'm running the platform, but we don't always communicate it to our community because, we have something to do, which is like literally run the business. And so we've been sharing I started to share some of like the roadblocks that we see on the back end. And so last year I just shared this this series of examples of images that were rejected for advertising by Facebook. So this, for example, this image, for example, this image. So all of these images were rejected on the grounds of promoting escorting services. And there's literally nothing here that is promoting escorting services. It's just like, it's so obvious and it's so disgusting. And it is so just like, there's so much historical context to this as well. This is not just a new thing. This is like the sexualization of Black and brown bodies and of queer people and of disabled people, and it's just so gross. And so I posted this and it got legs, right? So because I've also learned in dealing with these big tech platforms that they don't respond to you unless you call them out in the press. And so I released this, it started getting some press traction. And as a result, they reached out to me and they were like, hey, oh my God, let's like fix this for you. So they went through and they brought a moderator and they like manually updated everything and approved all these ads. And I said to them, that's great. What I'd love to do actually is meet with the team at Instagram and talk you through our experiences. What we can do is gather some research from our community, because Salty has this direct lifeline into our community is trans women, non-binary people, queer people, women, plus size people, disabled people. So we're really lucky in that we have access to this niche community. And they said, sure, we'd love to meet with you. And what was also happening as a result of this post is that people in our community were like, they started posting, this has happened to me too. This has happened to me too. Can you share my story? Can you share my story? And it became overwhelming all of this feedback we were getting from the community. And so I brought on, thankfully, because of this, like, there's a lot of people that work in the tech industry that are very interested in doing this kind of work, but they can't do it within their own institutions because a lot of their institutions don't value this kind of work. And so I started getting contacted by data analysts who have day jobs at Facebook and Twitter, but don't want to tell anyone that they're doing this secret work with Salty. So I have this incredible team of data analysts working with us, who worked with us to create a survey or a quiz where people could just like tell us their stories, tell us who they were, where they lived, how they identify, and send us examples of their content that was being flagged and moderated. And as a result, and so the idea was that we were going to take it to Instagram and be like, hey, look, what we've done the work for you here, look. And of course, what happened, which is what also always happens when you're calling out these big tech platforms, is that as soon as the press goes away and they've like done their bit, they just disappear because they want the illusion of doing the work without actually doing the work, because in order to do the work, they would have to literally rebuild all their internal processes. And there's no incentive for them to do that because that doesn't make them money. And so, of course, so they blew us off. Like they blew us off and off and off and off and off until we were just like, I was like, I'm releasing this report to the public. And so we launched it on our website, and y'all can read it if you want. We go into a little bit more detail about how we got here. But basically, we established a couple of key findings. And also, you know, we should say that these findings are representative of our community. So they're not representative of everybody in the whole entire world. But we did find that in our findings or in our research, queer folks and people of color were policed at a higher rate than other users. We saw like a really high instance of accounts being reinstated after people basically went through and what's it called? A lot of sorry, I'm
like
blanking. Yeah, so there's a high instance of false flagging is what we found. So it's like so the automatic processes for censoring and moderating was falling short, and then when they brought human people in to look at it, you know, it proved that there was like a high instance of the false flagging. Basically, also, we tested some advertising content as well. And if the user identified as a cis woman or a cis female founder that was creating products for women, their products were the most likely to be flagged than any other identity type. We also found that plus size and body positive profiles were flagged for sexual solicitation and excess nudity more than slimmer bodies were. We also found that, this is interesting, that the policies that were meant to protect users from racist or sexist behavior are harming the very groups that need protection. For example, the people who come under attack for their identity have been reported or banned instead of the attacker. So these self-moderation or community moderation tools are being weaponized against the people that they're supposed to protect. So for example, Celeste, that's an example that you brought up earlier. And interestingly, you know, respondents communicated this growing distrust of the platform. So because of this like opaque nature of the process of moderating and censorship and not being able to appeal, it was what they're building is like this like uneasy space for users.
And is a lot of this flagging that you're talking about, the false flagging in particular, Claire, is a lot of it automatic, or is a lot of it coming from other users also reporting? Do you know?
That's hard to tell. I mean, we don't know. Like, we don't have that information. But my instinct is that it's automatic. Most of this stuff that happens is automatic. These algorithms are incredibly sophisticated at this point as well. They're far more sophisticated than we can even imagine. So yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Claire. I mean, it's really helpful to hear anecdotes, but it's also super helpful when somebody, like Salty, puts all of this information together, really does research within their own community, and you've produced this incredible report, which really just names and pins down something that a lot of people, I think, have been feeling. So thank you for sharing that with us. Sorry, go on.
All right, we're actually about to release our second report. So this came out a year ago. I've been working on another one for a year, and so that's going to be coming out pretty soon as well. So keep your eyes.
I can't wait.
I know, it's so exciting.
Content.
It's really depressing, but it's great.
I know. It's so grim. I am compelled to remind everyone that if you'd like to ask questions, you can do so in the Q&A box below. And I just had a quick peek at the chat, and somebody said, I'm incredibly fired up. They were like, Sandra says, I love this talk, but I'm sitting here getting angrier by the minute and fired up in a good way. Thank you, Sandra. That is what we are here for. So Lola, I'm going to come to you to talk to us about, we've mentioned FOSTA SESTA a few times now. Can you tell us a little bit more? So there are a pair of laws that were passed in the US that have been very controversial. Can you give us a brief overview of what it is and the actual impact it's had, and also maybe why it's relevant to Australia as well?
Yeah, sure. So I think part of understanding the legislation is also, and how it affects specifically sex workers and by extension other marginalised communities, is understanding why and how sex workers use the internet. So sex workers were some of the earliest and first adopters of many mainstream websites. So sites like Tumblr, Patreon, we were there in the early days of Craigslist, the early 2000s. I'm pretty sure we've actually been booted from all three of those sites now. Anyway, so the reason that we did flood to these the internet and these sites is because the internet gave us the ability to access safer working conditions, and working conditions which were potentially free of exploitative third parties. So before the internet, before you could work on the internet, you mainly had three options of doing full service in-person sex work. So you had street work, brothel work, or agency work. Street work was obviously dangerous because in most places it is criminalised. So the likelihood of arrest and incarceration is quite high, as well as your ability to screen. You have a very, very short window of time to determine whether a person who you've never met before potentially is dangerous or not. The other two options were brothel and agency work. So under both of these, unfortunately, they have been tied, many establishments do have exploitative management practices because of the lack of oversight and the inability for workers to seek recourse because of criminality and stigma. So now we can work independently, and we do work kind of like freelance. So the internet has very much given us the ability to not only screen clients, but touching on what Claire was saying before, it's also given us the ability to work with other members of the community to understand and avoid being banned on platforms and erased. So one example of this was, I think this was last year when this was happening. But if you changed they were doing a sweep of shadow banning specifically women. And if we found out that if you changed your gender to male, you would have the shadow ban removed. So that was obviously like an algorithmic thing. Yeah, we definitely use it to avoid being censored by tech companies, and also warn each other of how to navigate harmful legislation that's just been passed. So back onto the harmful legislation that's just been passed. So one of these is FOSTA SESTA, which was a package bill that was signed into law in April of 2017 with a stated goal of reducing sex trafficking online. What it basically does is it takes aim at eroding Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act. The Section 230 is one of the main reasons that we have a free and open internet in the way that we do today. This piece of legislation basically provides immunity to interactive computer services from liability for the content that their users post. So without it, the platforms would be forced to either over-moderate or over-police the content on their platforms, or face civil or criminal litigation, which a lot of platforms that are smaller just simply can't afford to do. FOSTA SESTA specifically targets facilitation of prostitution. And so when this law was passed, as a website owner, you could now be held liable for the content that your users were posting if it was considered to be facilitation of prostitution. The bill is extremely vague, so there wasn't any specification as to what facilitation looks like or what prostitution looks like. So this has definitely led to the profiling of sex workers and the sort of assumption of what a sex worker looks like or does, or, you know, activities around sex work when it comes to outrage or censorship. Just look at my notes. Oh, and I think something also to keep in mind in terms of how this is affecting sex workers in Australia is that major internet companies and platforms that are dominating the English-speaking market right now are based primarily in the US, and therefore are subject to US legislation and also a US-based value system, which is a lot of where these problems are stemming from. So through FOSTA SESTA, sex workers essentially are experienced the first iteration of what the Black Lives Matter protesters are experiencing now, which is really, really scary. The immediate impact that the bill had was obviously a loss of ad and screening platforms, which we rely to advertise and keep safe, as well as the erasure from mainstream social media networks, as well as sort of other sites that you wouldn't expect FOSTA SESTA, or you wouldn't expect the platforms to have taken action, like Google Drive, for example, started clearing people's content without warning. Skype changed their terms of services to disallow nudity on the platform. And something else that doesn't get spoken about that much is that FOSTA SESTA very much legitimized the anti-trafficking movement. Why this impacts sex workers, as well as the stuff I spoke about previously, is because these groups have now developed apps to report people they think are victims of trafficking, which is obviously just a highway to racial profiling and yeah, really bad stuff.
Blimey.
So yeah, it's really, really, really bad. And they've also teamed up with mainstream hotels like the Marriott and Hilton to train staff on combating sex trafficking. Some of the criteria that they use in this training to spot victims of sex trafficking is things like being alone and being female. And which
very
is
dangerous
crazy.
things, right?
So dangerous, super dangerous. So, you know, and these are having real world effects as well. Like this is, people have been kicked out of hotels because of this. People have been kicked out of restaurants and other establishments because those establishments have been trying to learn from the bigger establishments. So this is very much having a real world effect right now. The other do I have a little bit more time to go through one more?
Just one more point.
I'm so sorry.
No, don't.
I'm like, I know this is a rant. So the last piece of legislation that I just want to cover quickly is, so this isn't the first time that they've tried to pass a bill under the guise of stopping sex trafficking. One of the most recent ones, which has been sort of circulating, is the EARNIT Act. And I highly encourage anyone who's listening today to go and do some research about the EARNIT Act, because it is a really scary bill, which might be being passed. Ultimately, this act threatens end-to-end encryption and therefore affects our ability to organise against things like fascism. So it's very, very similar to the AA bill, which was proposed in 2018 by the Australian government. It's important to understand that we're one of the Five Eyes countries, so it's not uncommon for countries to develop similar legislation or have smaller countries be the testing ground. I guess the takeaway from this sort of spiel that I've had, I'm sorry for putting everyone through like a 7-minute spiel, is that in 2020, we're living in such a digitized society that rules online are often almost as effective as the laws in offline society. And therefore, the rules that are affecting people online are having a much more significant impact than they would in 2005. And I think we really need to start having conversations and taking that more seriously.
Thank you, Lola. And no need to ever apologize for a 7-minute spiel.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No. It reminds me, and no, this is a complete tangent. I remember I was doing a talk once, and we were a panel of 3, and we were all given, it was a 15-minute session, and we were all given 5-minute, very explicit 5 minutes. And the first guy stood up and spoke for 15 minutes.
Oh, man.
And I was like, dude, we all still have to talk, right? Yeah. People PowerPoints. Like, I was like, mate, it's a 5-minute talk. You've got 17 slides. The maths doesn't add up. Like, why? Yeah. So never apologize, Lola. Thank you. And I like, jokes aside, I think I had not heard of the EARNIT bill that you're speaking about, which is shame on me, but also incredibly important for, as you say, all of us to be really aware of, because lots of legislation, especially in a time like now where there's COVID and the US election and all sorts of other things happening, that it's easy for these things to sort of like get passed, swept under the rug. All the sort of COVID legislation around surveillance and so on that passed in March in countries around the world. I think there is so much information that we can miss these things, but they do, as you say, have much more impact on our lives. And it's so hard to live outside. It's so hard to live a completely offline life. It's almost impossible. We don't have as much agency and choice. But anyway, I'm not going to go on rant. I'm going to come to you, Celeste, because we've kind of left you in the corner a little bit, and that's totally my fault. So firstly, is there anything that we've spoken about that you'd like to add on before I come to talk about expression?
Nah.
All right, sweet. Okay, great. Well, so one of the things is, this panel is about censorship and expression. And interestingly, there was a 2018 Macquarie University report looking at being Indigenous online. And while the majority of the study's respondents indicated they use social media to connect with their community in some way, they also expressed concerns around cultural practice, expression, and knowledge online, particularly in relation to the breaking of cultural protocol, the danger of cultural appropriation, and the misattribution of culture. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this. I mean, there is a lot of conversation around cultural appropriation and misattribution of culture and stuff online. What is your kind of perspective on this as an Indigenous woman? All right.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to, community, like what is community and what is connection, and can community and connection still exist virtually? And if so, at what point does the virtual connection no longer uphold the best interests of the community? I feel when it comes to those cultural protocols that we speak of and that we abide by, I guess, in our communities, I feel that that can only be learned through a level of experience, through a lived experience within those protocols, and that goes for both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. It's about being active in those communities and learning and doing deep listening, and and how do you do that deep listening online? And so when it comes to culture, it is difficult to set boundaries and uphold cultural protocols online. It's hard for our elders to do that, especially when they're not as present as our younger ones. And then I get concerned for our younger ones, because are they then learning about cultural protocol through a digital platform? And so, we've seen a rise in the appropriation of art. Even that's just one example. We've seen a really high number of non-Indigenous people appropriating our art, and I guess, and selling them for profit. So it is hard when, I guess, setting those boundaries around protocol and culture is hard, and I don't feel like people are doing their research or their due diligence when it comes to consuming that content and consuming culture, especially when it's not theirs. So, you know, and not enough people are asking the right questions. So I guess, and that's where that misinformation and misinterpretation of our culture can also come into it. But we are, Indigenous people are high adopters of Facebook and social media. And so I guess to combat that and to combat not feeling like we have a place on there, we've actually created our own online spaces that are just for us, you know, where we can, I guess, exist, and, you know, we moderate them ourselves, and we engage with our community. We make connections with different mob. I mean, I built quite amazing relationships from social media. I've gotten jobs off of social media, you know, so we are very active, and we are very creative. You know, we're an innovative people, and so it's, I guess it's, you know, of course, we would build our own platforms and communities when we have continuously been denied access to others. So I guess there's no one way to experience and express identity, and that translates online. There are commonalities in the way that we identify with each other and how we express it, but we're all on our own journeys of learning. I guess that, you know, these online spaces have become important for us in terms of having a voice and being heard. You know, and we are able now to represent ourselves how we want, and present the positivity and the love within our communities with the wider community, because we don't always get the opportunity to. So there's no one way to exist online. I just feel when it comes to a culture that you don't know, act accordingly. You know your place. Just as I know my place in my hierarchy unit within my family, there is a place. If you're not from the culture, you know, there's a certain way that you need to act when you're participating or engaging within it. So we can't spoon feed people either. You know,
I mean, one of the things you just said, which I thought was interesting, is like people aren't asking the right questions. What questions do you think they should be asking, if I can be so bold?
I guess, well, we'll use art. You know, there's what people need to understand in terms of Indigenous people here in Australia is that whilst we're all Indigenous peoples, there are hundreds of cultures within this country. You know, my culture from Birragubba mob was going to be different from somebody else's. And so we all have our own ways of doing and operating within our communities. And so I guess if you're going to buy Aboriginal art, you need to be asking the artist questions about what the art is, where it comes from, who they are, and how this relates to them and their communities. I mean, you know, we've seen a lot of discussion in our community as of late around the appropriation of art and other cultures. And so I guess our community has been talking about it, and sometimes the wider community isn't privy to those conversations, but I guess it's just about having those conversations, building relationships first, you know, build the relationship first, ask the questions, don't be shame about it. If you're wrong, you're wrong. But, you know, there's always a moment for transformation. But I guess it's that, and this is what I ask all white people, if I'm being real, you know, it's like, what's your commitment to the action of you know, change or of your own learnings, because as we were saying before, you know, everyone want to talk about it but no one want to be about it. And you know, I guess we are very much a culture that is resilient, and so whether that's in real life or online, you know, we're quite staunch, and I don't think anyone's really been unapologetic about their stance on things within our community, or even on Black Twitter, but you know, because that's where it's at. But you know, I just really, sometimes my community just really I'm just so in admiration of my community sometimes, just the level of strength that comes from it, even when we're being told that we're not allowed to be strong. So yeah, I don't know, I may have gone off on a little track there.
No, that's great. It's funny, I said to someone the other day that, like, so, you know, being Black African people, I think folks from outside the community sometimes think, oh, you know, like, your aunties are a bit scary, but you're not scared of your aunties. I'm like, I'm just as terrified of my Black aunties, my you know, my staunch African aunties from across the continent as anyone else. No matter how old I get, I will continue to be terrified and in awe. Right? There's a level of deference that doesn't disappear. You know.
That's an auntie. I'm scared of it.
100%. She will put me in my place no matter how distant, even if she's never seen me before. She'll be like, okay, so just before I ask you all a quick last question, I'm going to remind folks that if you have any questions, you can put your hand up, your little blue hand in the participants tab, or you can put a little question in the Q&A. We'd love your questions. The last question that I'm going to ask you all panelists, I mean, what ways, and I mean, this is one of those broad questions that we could have a whole panel on, but how can we look at the internet governance community, that maybe the people in the audience that we're speaking to, how can people play a role in minimizing the harm in digital spaces? Are there actions that individuals can take? Or is this, you know, is this a much more systemic thing? And even if it is, which I believe it would be, what do you urge individuals to do? Celeste, I'll come to you.
Okay, great. I was like, okay. You know, when it comes back to that, you know, it's not enough to just not be racist. You actually have to be anti-racist. You actually have to be proactive about not being racist. And so, like, when you see things happening, even just around you or even online that you don't agree with, I mean, share it, support us, back us, stand by it, and I guess have our backs. And, you know, we want to know that we're supported. We don't want to have to, you know, I said before, we don't want to spoon feed people. We don't have the time. You know, so I mean, do your own research. You got Google. You go, you know, access the communities that you're a part of. Learn about the mob where you come from and where you live. Look at their lands and their traditional owners there. I mean, do the research. It's 2020, and there really isn't any excuse to not know anymore or be ignorant. There's just, you know, there's no excuse for it. So, I mean, stand up and be loud about it, and be loud with us and support us on our journey to freedom.
Hallelujah. Yes. I am in the Church of Celeste right here. All right, Claire.
Yes. I guess I would say to the people that are here that work in tech, which I think that there are many people here that do work in tech, is to make sure that you are fighting that every single room that you're working in is diverse. You have to bring people in, and you have to fight for them, and you have to make sure you listen to them once you bring them in, because they will change the product that you are building, and you have to be okay with that, and you have to be excited about that, because that's what's beautiful about it. So fight to bring them in the room, make sure they're safe once they're there, and be able to iterate the product once you build it. So that's my biggest thing. And then also, when you're building these products and thinking about the products that you're building, make sure that there's safety valves for people. Make sure that there's places where your users can go when they're feeling unsafe, that they can tap into for you to help them there.
Thanks, Claire. And Lola?
So I would totally agree with both of you. I think you covered two of my points there. But the other two that I had was start using products and services which aren't based in the US to draw some of the monopoly away from the US, so that their legislation doesn't have as big of an impact on people in Australia. Obviously, that's not an end solution, but it should help. The other thing is, if you run a company, which I'm sure that someone in the audience does, which currently excludes sex workers from the use of your product, I want you to question why that is and change it if you can. If you can't because of legislation or whatever, you owe that community at least a financial donation, as you're contributing to the violence against us by facilitating the erasure of us. If you're complicit in this, you need to be funding those who are dedicating their lives to changing the legislation that's making you complicit.
Here. I am feeling very inspired. Okay, but we're not done yet, because we have some questions, which is fantastic. So Lucy from Digital Rights Watch says, I'd love to hear more about the online payments platforms. When PayPal/Stripe or any others shut down accounts, what is the process for you? And is there a legal pathway to get your accounts back?
So as far as PayPal and Stripe go, I think there's actually a worker. I need to confirm which platform she is currently taking action against, but there is a worker who's currently taking action against one of these platforms because of their policies, and she is a worker who is currently working in New South Wales, I believe, so it is decriminalised. In terms of PayPal and Stripe, when they do take the accounts, I am unsure of the legal recourse, to be honest. No one I know has been able to take legal recourse, because I think something that also gets forgotten about is that in order to take legal recourse in the first place, you need to disclose your legal name. And by disclosing your legal name, obviously you're opening yourself up to doxing and a whole other host of really dangerous things that could happen to you. So often, a huge part of the problem with criminalisation and stigma is that any form of crime or harm that is done for you, you have the complete inability to seek recourse and maintain a safe environment around you.
Thank you. We've got a question from Jacqueline Knight for Celeste. Celeste, do you have some advice about where to go for the right information and who we can direct our questions to if we're seeking credible information and knowledge about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples? I know you spoke about this a little bit, but it seems like Jacqueline's looking for more specific guidance.
Yasmin, it's Jacqueline on the line. Can I jump in?
Oh yeah, please. Yeah.
Unmute powers. Yes. But it was a bit of a question for Celeste, but it's also equally for Claire and other members of the panel. So you have talked a bit about asking questions, investigating. I feel it's been really insightful, and the discussions today are very new for me. And I think as someone who makes a conscious effort to try and be well read and to investigate, even literature that's from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, from transgender people, there's still, I'm a heterosexual white woman, so I haven't lived those experiences, and I still feel like, even though I'm taking the time to get exposure to that, I feel way out of my depth, and I'm interested and conscious of wanting to understand, as I said, just getting exposure today about the challenges that people experience that are just completely new to me. So it's about, when the question I asked to Celeste was not just about general information, but I guess if there's, are there good sources to go to? Are there channels to follow, or particular outlets, communications outlets? I mean, Salty is obviously a great example of that, but just trying to get better informed for someone who doesn't understand these areas, but is interested to do so in a sensitive way, so that when you want to start having conversations about these sort of topics, you're doing so in a way that's respectful and is not going to unintentionally hurt or embarrass or do damage. So that's sort of something that I'm quite conscious of, and was interested to get some more advice from you, Celeste, and from other members of the panel about dealing with marginalised groups, having not experienced that myself.
Yeah, I guess it's always there's a hashtag, or buy Indigenous, and I guess it's always good to buy from Indigenous owned companies, I guess, and look for the right channels where they'll aim to serve and to protect the buyer and the artists involved, I guess. But it's not just about art. I think that, going to your local land council as well and having conversations, but you just got to do the research, and that's what it comes back to. And I guess because in the job that I do, I have to communicate with a lot of big tech companies and have those uncomfortable conversations with them. And I have to remind them, it's you have to become comfortable with the uncomfortable, because if you're not uncomfortable, then I'm not doing my job. So, my job is to make you uncomfortable here, because, it's about that learning and confronting it. So I guess I just think it's doing the research, having conversations, going into your local land council, looking for Indigenous owned companies and organizations, and seeing if you can help out, if you can volunteer your time, or maybe you have a skill set that they might need. Things like that. So thinking about what you can contribute, what you yourself can contribute, and where you think that you might be of value to somebody or an organization. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but there's so many different layers to our communities that sometimes you just got to start at the basics, and it's just about identifying what you bring to the table.
I'm going to also add, oh, sorry, go on, Claire, please.
I just want to say that, like, as a white person who is interested in learning about people of color and transgender experiences and experiences that are outside of your own, that it's not on those people to educate you how to do it. And I know it's tempting to come into this space and be like, Celeste, tell me how to do it. It's like, girl, it is on you. You have to go out and you have to do it yourself, and you have to decenter your experience, and you have to listen, and it takes work, and you're going to have to look at some really ugly parts of yourself, but you're going to have to do it, and she can't teach you how to do it.
I'm not gonna add anything else to that. The one other thing I will say is, like, if I went through the world, you know, the most of the countries that I've lived in are English-speaking white majority countries, and I've had to learn how to survive as, you know, like a migrant Sudanese Muslim woman. I've had to learn the way of the white man in order to survive. My knowledge of the white world is just as intimate as it is of my world, but it never goes the other way around. There are very few white men or women that really have an intimate idea of what my inner world is like, or what my, you know, community is like. And that's not because the information is sacrosanct necessarily. It's because they haven't taken the time. And I was having a conversation recently with one of my quite good friends, and I was like, do you actually know anything about what I believe? And they were like, oh, well, no, I've never really thought to ask. And we've been friends for many years, but there's this kind of like, oh, it's your own thing and it's not really about me. But I think there's also a bit of a push to be like, well, yes, it might be private, and you might be scared of asking, but at the same time, there's a difference between asking where I'm from being the very first question you ask me, to like after being friends with somebody, or after, you know, being curious about the world. Ultimately, I think it is about being curious about the worlds of others, and about really wanting to know because you care, because you're interested, because you're inquisitive. I mean, these are all things that we can learn, and they're not difficult. They just take a little bit of extra work. Now, okay, we're running out of time. I've overstepped. We've got a few more questions. And okay, very quickly, we've got one from Alexa. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Has there been any case where a platform has allowed for an independent study on how their algorithms end up making certain decisions? Claire, can I come to you?
Yeah, I would say that no, never. Like, they hide them. They're like super proprietary, secret information. I don't know of anyone that they don't tell anybody what they are.
Ew. Is the answer to that.
Computer says
computer says no. Not happy.
And they're constantly changing as well. That's the other thing, is that they change all the time.
We actually have another really interesting one. Claire, many people don't think about persons with disabilities as sexual beings. Can you tell us about the issues that have come up when Salty portrays their stories?
Well, Salty doesn't portray their stories. Salty just lets the people with disabilities tell their stories. And that's the fundamental difference, is that we are a platform that passes a mic directly to those people to speak their own stories in their own voices, which is actually different from a traditional media platform. So, and on top of that, if it's written by a person with a disability, it's also top edited by a person with a disability as well, because something that you see in some like media outlets is that, you know, the top editor just like butchers somebody's piece because they have no similar lived experience. What's the actual question?
Just, they say many people don't think about persons with disabilities as sexual beings. Can you tell us about the issues that have come up?
The issues?
Perhaps around censorship? Like, are there more?
I mean, the issues are the same as the issues that we're facing with our other users.
Communities.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I've got very few minutes remaining, so I'm gonna. Sandra says, riffing on what Alexa said, is there a platform that's trying to get better, or putting it another way, who's the least worst? I don't know if anyone has any least worst suggestions. Claire.
I hate them all. I didn't just like, oh God.
Lola, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the reality is that the majority of these platforms are are run by those who are upholding white supremacist heteropatriarchal norms. So, you know, I don't think there is a platform out there that is currently not doing that, that is a mainstream social media platform. And I also don't know how to, I don't know what a platform that doesn't have those laws, that, well, I mean, doesn't have those values looks like, because we haven't had that before.
Well, I will say that this is tangentially, this is related though. It has a lot to do with the venture capital machine that is building these products as well, because venture capital funds these products. And when you have venture capitalists who have invested tens of millions or hundreds of billions of dollars into these products, they expect a return, which only comes at scale. And so they build scale. And it is fundamentally impossible to build a product on venture capital that is not a vehicle for white supremacy, because that's how it works. So the way that these platforms are funded has everything to do with the products that they are. So the least worst, I would hope, are community created platforms that are funded by people in the communities. But you can't scale with that kind of funding. So it's like,
All right, folks, we have run out of time. No, that's, thank you so much, Celeste, Claire, Lola. What I will say, last couple of words, minoritized and marginalized people have all sorts of weapons used against them and have for a long time. And it's easy for folks not to care about them until they come to your doorstep. This is stuff that we should all care about, not just because other people are getting hurt, but because how we protect the most vulnerable in our communities says everything about who we are as a society. And we need to take this very seriously. And I know that you take it seriously because you're on this call. Thank you all so much. And I'm going to hand over now to Melody.
Thank you, thank you, Yasmin, and thank you, everyone. I just want to also mention that Yasmin joined us while it is 6:30 a.m. where she is. So really dedication right there. Thank you, Yasmin, for such great moderation. I am feeling super salty that there's censorship with marginalized communities. And I hope everyone who has been watching are feeling super salty about that as well, and bring that energy with you in your daily lives and also in our session for day 2 tomorrow. But also feel inspired, because I'm feeling inspired by our great speakers and moderator as well. And from this entire day, I hope you've had a really good experience. And I hope this panel has been as engaging for you as it has been for me. So thank you so much, speakers. I will now pass the floor to Andrew, our chair for NetThing, and he will do the closing remarks for us. So thank you, Claire, Lola, and Celeste.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
ya.
Well, that was excellent. I wish I was a cleverer person and I could figure out a way to draw all of this together. At the start of the day, I said that I hope this forum would be something that would allow people to be activist, informed and involved, where we could come together and hear all sorts of different perspectives. And the people that came here would be respectful and knowledgeable of other agendas and perspectives. I don't know that I can draw together a theme that overarches the whole day. I could see points of resonance in almost every session. Everything we're talking about, although we're talking about technology, is an intensely human activity, because ultimately that's what we are. And it's very easy to see things as other than us, but I think having this sort of dialogue builds a connection between people. And one of the points of resonance, I guess, that I heard was a call to activism. That being informed and being there, participating in decision making, it's really hard. That last panel was saying, you know, it's really difficult to know unless you know someone what you can do to make a difference, you know, with the big tech companies or with the internet or how everything operates. So there is a bit of a call there to find allies and alliances and fellow travellers to be able to explain what your interests are and what your desires are, and to be able to listen to other people and find that connection as well. I guess the other thing that has resonated all the way through is we're not just purely talking the internet, we're not just purely talking government or government overreach or laws or economics. We're actually talking about a really confused nexus between all of them. And, you know, teasing these things out, thinking clearly, and, you know, understanding what the essential things are out of all of this. That's the challenge for us going forward. A lot of today's discussion has been people describing the circumstances that we are in, but not necessarily seeing, well, is there a place for me to be involved in coming to solutions? And that's partly the format of today, panel discussions and some Q&As. We have tried to be as interactive as possible, but really tomorrow might be where the rubber hits the road on some of that. Melody, could you put up those slides that we were talking about earlier? So first I would like to thank our sponsors for making all of this possible. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to put together. Their resources have enabled us to do it. And in particular, I would like to thank Melody and Apnic today because they have been excellent. If we could move on, please, to the next slide. Yep. So tomorrow morning, we have a 9:15 opening, and our first session is running from 9:30 to 10:45. It's the Beginner's Guide to Internet Governance. And, you know, it's being led by a couple of our steering committee members to really talk about what some of the moving parts are in terms of internet governance, but it's meant to be pretty free form and informal discussion between people to talk about what are they interested in this area. So I encourage you to attend that. GoDaddy Registry have a session on DNS abuse. We talked about it a little bit today, you know, some dimensions of it, but they're going to go into a bit more of a deep dive of it. And so we'll get into there. At 12:10, we have a quiz, trivia quiz, also hosted by GoDaddy Registry, which is going to be marvelous. And then following that, we have lined up Peter Lewis's Tech Talk Australia at Home discussion. Lizzie O'Shea will be on that call as well, I understand. And I think they're planning on reviewing Netflix's documentary, The Social Dilemma, and talking about that. Then, as I mentioned this morning, Outer are having a workshop really talking about their future. What are their strategic priorities? How should they interact with the broader internet community? What should they be doing in future? And this is one of those things where you can get involved, you know, at an early stage and talk with people about, well, you know, what are they hoping for, and inform what decisions are they making. So I strongly encourage you to participate in that. And finally, at the end of the day, between 4 and 5, the former chair of NetThing, Sandra Davey, will be leading a conversation on the future of NetThing. What worked, what didn't work, what should be changed, you know, what should be kept. And again, we're looking for your involvement on that, because this is ultimately all about you. This is about, well, we've talked about the multi-stakeholder community and the internet community, but it's about all of us as humans talking with each other about what matters and where we want to go to next. So I guess in conclusion, I would like to thank all of the participants today, those that have attended, and our panelists in particular, the people that have made this possible. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I'll hand back to Melody at this stage.
Thanks, Andrew. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope it has been an insightful and inspiring day one for you. Maybe you've made a new connection in the social room or took away an insight from a speaker. Whatever it may be, we hope to see you back here tomorrow for day 2. It will be more interactive with deep diving workshops. Plus, it will be in meeting mode, so a little bit more sociable. Remember, NetThing is by the community for the community. Your voice is just as valid and valuable as the speakers you've just seen today. So that's all from me, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you.